I've often said that critical race theory and what is taking place in our schools is the civil rights issue of our times. Joining me today will be an attorney who can shed more light on that. Stay tuned. Welcome to another episode of Conversations with Dr. Carol Swain. This is the show where I talk about anything and everything that's on my mind. I've been talking about critical race theory now for a long time. I think I started talking about it frequently about 4 years ago when I started to really see that it was impacting our society. I did not anticipate how it would reach our K through 12 schools and the impact that it would be having on our children. And so today's show, joining me is Braden Busak. Braden is Director of Litigation of an Atlanta-based constitutional public interest law firm, the Southeastern Legal Foundation. And so Braden is going to talk with us about a case that is taking place in Illinois. But before we get to that case, that you will want to hear all about. Braden, welcome to Conversations, and we'd like to hear about critical race theory. Like, you went to law school, so you probably heard of it a long time ago. So talk about critical race theory, and also welcome to Conversations.
Thanks, Dr. Swain. It's a pleasure to be on. You're right. I probably did get advanced preview of critical race theory because I've gone to law school. But critical race theory is now an idea that doesn't just exist in law schools anymore. And it probably sounds like a lot of people to be a relatively innocuous or dry academic term, but it actually is a dangerous ideology that underneath it contains principles that are utterly at war with America's founding era ideals and basic notions of individual liberty. So America, as you are well aware of, is founded on the core truth that all men are created equal. There's no such thing as an American race. And the Constitution and the notions of the American founding exist to protect individual liberty. And equality under the law is a principle that Americans have fought and died for over the course of centuries. Critical race theory, in contrast, embraces the definition of equity as the ultimate goal of government instead of the protection of individual liberty. What critical race theory does is it looks at individuals based on superficial characteristics such as race or group identity, and then that assigns individual and moral characteristics to those superficial characteristics, and says that you hold those characteristics and that moral component with you until from birth until death. They cannot be shed. And under critical race theory, the only thing that can be done is for the government to work to achieve equal outcomes become disparate groups. Okay. But what makes it so at war with American principles is that it subordinates individual liberty to collective group claims.
Okay, thank you so much for explaining that in a very eloquent way. And so I'm going to break it down more simply for the audience in the sense that, you know, if you have children in school, you've heard of critical race theory by now, and it's based on, you know, it has Marxist underpinnings, and it divides the world into the oppressed and the oppressors. And white people in America are considered the oppressors. There's an argument that if you're born with white skin, then you have a property interest in your whiteness, and that you somehow, you know, have benefited from oppressing other groups, and you are told that you have to first renounce who you are, renounce your ancestors, and become consciously anti-racist. And becoming anti-racist, like for most of us, right, Braden, we all want to be anti-racist. Everyone should be anti-racist, but according to critical race theory, only white people are being asked to be anti-racist. And then minorities are told that they are victims, that they are oppressed. And we're also told through this critical race theory and critical legal studies that racism is permanent. And if it's permanent, there's nothing you can do about it. And so it has become, such a drag on our educational system. And what bothers me, Braden, is the shaming of children. I don't care whether they're black or white. It's anti-American, and no decent person would shame a person because of the color of their skin or some other immutable characteristic. So that's my 2 cents, and I will yield to you, Braden.
Well, I think it's useful to point out that the shaming of children is a huge part of bringing critical race theory into schools. If you're going to group your students up based on their race and then teach one group that they're in the oppressor class and all they can do is address their privilege by confessing their sins to the other group, then you're teaching non-white kids to hate, and you're teaching white kids to hate themselves. All of that is unconstitutional. All of that is wrong. And it's not too much to say that what's going on in a lot of school districts, including the school district of Chicago that we sued, is literal separation of groups of students and faculty members based on their race. They use the term affinity group, but all an affinity group is lining up faculty members or students into groups, separating them and treating them differently based on their race. And segregating school children, segregating faculty members based on their race is wrong, and it's unconstitutional.
And so we know, as far as the Constitution, that every person is protected by the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. But when it comes to our civil rights laws, how does that, this resegregation of America, how does that, connect with civil rights laws that we passed in 1964 and we amended, I think, in 1972, and many state and local governments have their own civil rights laws. So how is it that you have this critical race theory sweeping America, affecting just about every sector, and at the same time we have civil rights laws and we have a Constitution?
The civil rights laws and the Equal Protection Clause both speak directly to treating school children differently based on their race. And that matters in this case. So the Civil Rights Act, of course, is ultimately the culmination of the principle of equality as expressed in the Declaration of Independence. That is a principle that we defended in the Civil War. That is a principle that we codified with the 14th and 15th Amendments, and then codified again in the Civil Rights Act. So it's not too much to say that of all of America's freedoms, the right to be treated equally based on your race is the one that we have fought for the hardest and bled the most. Now, the client that we represent, Ms. Stacey Demar in this case, she actually filed a civil rights complaint with the Office of Civil Rights Enforcement. And this was in response to the district's overt embrace of what you've called accurately anti-racist training. But what it actually looks like is an unremitting campaign of harassment and unequal treatment based on the race of a student or faculty member or parent. And in January, go ahead.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. We have to take a break. And when we return, I want you to get into the nitty-gritty of that case that you're involved with.
Absolutely.
We'll be back after this word from our sponsor.
Conversations with Dr. Carol Swain is made possible by Cooper Steel, a family-owned business that provides the steel fabrications for some of the greatest buildings across the United States. 60 years ago, Kenneth and Faye Cooper founded their company in Shelbyville, Tennessee.
Cooper Steel believes in sponsoring Carol Swain because we believe as she does, you build strong, you stand strong.
What started as a vision and now a nationally recognized and operated company that remains true to its founders' Judeo-Christian values and principles. Cooper Steel is committed to excellence, responsibility, and community. Cooper Steel's motto is, build strong, stand strong. They treat their employees and customers like family. Thank you to Cooper Steel for standing strong with Conversations with Dr. Carol Swain. Learn more about our generous sponsor at coopersteel.com.
I'm back with my guest, Braden Busack, and Braden was talking about a case he's involved in out of Illinois. So would you take it from the top and tell our viewers about this case and why it's so important to our nation?
Sure. Simply put, this is a case about defending against state-sanctioned racism. We represent a lady, Stacey Demar. She's our client, and she's a drama teacher in the Chicago area school district. And despite her commitment to educating today's youth, life has not been easy for her over the last several years. In fact, after the district began to openly embrace anti-racism as a core principle throughout their curriculum, Ms. Demar filed a civil rights complaint with the Office of Civil Rights Enforcement. And in January of this year, the Office of Civil Rights Enforcement returned an 18-page letter of finding that declared that what was going on in her school district actually violated the Civil Rights Act. And then unfortunately, with the change of administrations that followed shortly thereafter, pursuant to President Biden's decree on equity and equality, equity and diversity, the OCR letter of finding was withdrawn. However, irrespective of that fact, the Civil Rights Act and the Equal Protection Clause both permit Ms. Demar to file complaints on her own. We represent her in the court of law, and we're looking forward to taking it to court.
So how often is it that a civil rights agency would withdraw one of its own decisions?
I think that's very unusual, and it speaks to a worrisome trend of politicization of some of our government bureaucracies. And, you know, if we can't count on a bipartisan consensus against what is actually a form of segregation in schools, then it's very disheartening. But we're encouraged by the fact that we at Southeastern Legal Foundation, we exist to protect people like Ms. Demar, and this is our job, and we're looking forward to engaging.
Well, Braden, one of the things that I don't really understand is if you look at members of Congress, and some years ago I had the demographics of Congress, and at that time about 40% of the members of Congress had a legal background. They were trained as attorneys. How could anyone who has studied the Constitution, some of the members of Congress now are old enough, you know, to remember the Civil Rights Movement, the Civil Rights Acts, civil rights laws, how could these people be going along with this particular moment that we're going through in America?
Well, I agree with you. It's remarkable to see that so many Americans are openly rebelling against the vision articulated by Dr. King of a colorblind society. And that's actually at work in a lot of anti-racist training that overtly teaches that colorblindness or notions of colorblindness are actually tools of white supremacy.
Right.
And that the only way that we can actually get over the nation's history of racism is by engaging in present racism, treating different Americans differently. And that notion is really mirrors the notion of separate but equal. And, you know, we can talk about segregation, we can talk about separate but equal, but these are ideas that the Supreme Court overturned 70 years ago. And that represented a watershed moment in American history. It was the redemption of the promissory note spoken of by Dr. King. And that principle is just too important to allow any backsliding now.
There's so much going on because I feel like that King and everything he stood for has been canceled, even though, you know, I don't know that anyone stepped forward to say we're canceling King because of, but we see that his ideals have been rejected. And also, you know, the same people that reject colorblindness also reject any notion of a meritocracy. They've put forth the idea that hard work, planning for the future, getting to places on time, that all of this is whiteness as well. And what's very dangerous about critical race theory as it is being taught in our schools, for racial and ethnic minorities, everything that made for success for people like me, who were able to take advantage of the opportunities created by the civil rights movement, if we had received and internalized the messages we're sending young people today, I don't think that any progress would have been made. And it seems like we're at a moment where the worst racism, I think, is critical race theory because it is racist itself, and it's racist against white people. And Braden, you may be too young to remember this, but back, in the 80s and 90s, white people talked about reverse discrimination, and just about everyone laughed at the idea that white people could be discriminated against. Well, here we are, fast forward, and the discrimination against white people because of the color of their skin, it is so blatant. And I believe that racial and ethnic minorities in the various communities, that we have to stand up and fight for the civil rights of white people the same way many white people joined forces with us and fought for our civil rights.
So I think you're absolutely right to point out that anti-racism training represents an ultimate renunciation of Dr. King's vision of a colorblind society. And so even if they won't expressly disavow Dr. King, they are expressly disavowing colorblindness. Again, they overtly teach that saying we live in a colorblind society or preaching the virtues of colorblindness is a tool of white supremacy. And what that actually looks like in places like District 65 is lumping white people into a fundamental group and assigning it moral characteristics. We have school books taught to preschool students containing captions that say things like, whiteness is a bad deal, and it always was. And then within that school book, it's actually got a picture of a literal white devil holding up a contract binding you to whiteness. And what that contract includes, and I'm looking at it here, is you will get stolen land, stolen riches, special favors, and whiteness gets you to mess endlessly with the lives of your friends, neighbors, loved ones, and all humans of color. All you have to do is sign away your soul. And this goes on, the same book teaches.
How evil. I mean, who?
That is taught in pre-K.
So, I mean, who put together that curriculum, and who are the idiots that approved it? I mean, it's so evil. I can't imagine that most Americans, if they actually saw those materials, that they would support it. I don't care about which political party. How could anyone support that?
I cannot speak to that, but that is really just the tip of the iceberg. That is not a cherry-picked example. This same book proclaims the message that racism is a white person's problem and we are all caught up in it. It says that students should consider what it means to be white, but not part of whiteness. It says that white people have a very, very serious problem and they should think about what to do with it. And it goes on to other portions of the school's curriculum teach such things as that it is important to disrupt the Western nuclear family dynamics as the best and proper way to have a family. And so the district unremittingly teaches that racism can only occur when it's a white on minority situation, but it is not possible for a minority person to commit an act of racism against a so-called white person.
Well, I mean, I've heard that ever since I started college, that only white people could be racist. And I questioned it back then, and the argument was that only white people had power and that you had to have power to be racist. And we know that we've had a black president elected twice with 2 black attorney generals. We've had blacks in positions of power, throughout time, but especially, in the last 50 years. But this whole idea that only white people can be racist, I think most people that think about it know that any race or ethnicity has the ability to exert power over other groups, and they can practice racism. Braden, we're going to take a break. When we return, I want you to talk with our viewers about things they can do and how to gather evidence and just how they can bring their own cases. So we'll be back after this moment.
Dr. Carol Swain's Be the People, a call to reclaim America's faith and promise, newly released in paperback and audio with a new introduction, is a challenge to all Americans. If you are serious about being the best citizen you can be, this is the book for you. From addressing moral relativism to reclaiming the future, you'll understand why Dr. Swain is one of the most relevant voices in today's culture war. Are you ready to reclaim America's faith and promise? Purchase at bethepeoplenews.com/books or wherever books are sold.
The Biden administration's executive order on immigration brings to the forefront one of the most volatile issues of our time. In this timely second edition of Debating Immigration, I join my voice to that of other experts to provide you with facts and information that will help you understand what is at stake for our nation. This edition offers 21 original essays that cover race, religion, economics, human smuggling, and civil rights.
Purchase at bethepeoplenews.com/books or wherever books are sold.
I'm back with my guest, Braden Busack, with the Southeastern Legal Foundation. He's a head litigator, and he's been talking about a case out of Illinois. And so, Braden, would you pick up, but also tell our viewers how they can bring their own cases and what type of evidence they should gather?
Well, thanks for the invitation. I mean, first and foremost, parents and citizens need to be vigilant and watchful over what's being taught in their schools. They need to be mindful of that. And that's something that we've never asked of previous generations before. But we need to demand that school boards are fully transparent with what is in their school curriculum. And we're starting to see a trend among educators and school boards of trying to deny access to educational materials to parents and citizens for fear that they'll see what's actually being taught. And of course, the pandemic and Zoom school really opened up a lot of eyes about what's going on in schools. Second, parents and citizens need to hold their local school boards and state officials accountable for what's being taught in schools. We wouldn't have this problem if states were exerting their responsibility to ensure that school children are taught the value of individual liberty and the price that Americans have paid throughout the centuries to ensure it. Third and finally, there is always legal action. You cannot treat school children differently based on their race, full stop. So what parents need to do is gather examples of differential racial treatment, and then parents need to present that to outlets like ours, Southeastern Legal Foundation, and consider bringing legal challenges on that front. But the proof is in the pudding. Everyone needs to see the evidence.
I know a lot of parents who are reluctant to speak out, and these are parents also in public schools. And you know, and I know that the way they get into the schools is by using diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so on the surface, you know, it sounds great. Who can be against diversity? Who can be against equity and inclusion? That's how they get into the system. And so they're in public schools, private schools, Christian schools that are private as well. And when parents see these things happening, a lot of them know it's wrong, but they are fearful of speaking up. Any advice about how to deal with the fear? And I have my own ideas, but I'd like to hear what you would say to these parents that see this taking place. They know it's wrong, but they don't want to be the first one to speak up.
Well, I'm sensitive to the concern. I can speak to it personally. I know what it takes to speak up. But an informed citizenry also has to be a courageous citizenry. All of this is going to slip away if we don't have people who are willing to stand up. The one thing I will tell parents is organize. There's a lot more people like you than you probably realize, and there's safety in numbers, and iron sharpens iron. But they should ultimately be aware of the fact that public schools are arms of the government. They hold all the power, they hold all the authority, and the check for that is in the courtroom. So I know that there's many parents out there who are disheartened by the trends that they see, but they should take heart from how strong our Constitution is. We've got a really vigorous cultural history and legal history here that can be brought directly to bear. We just need people to come forward.
Right, and I agree that organizing is the key to success. And you may have followed what happened in Southlake, Texas, where the parents got together. They even formed a political action committee, and they were able to elect 2 school board members and to get a critical mass to take over the school board. And so that's one thing that parents can do. But for the most part, you know, the parent should be the child's advocate. The children should not have to be dealing with these issues that lead to depression and all sorts of behaviors, strange behaviors, because not every child is coming home telling their parents what is happening in the classroom. And so the parents need to listen to one another and organize and gather evidence in case it does lead to a court case?
I agree. Parents need to inform themselves, they need to educate themselves, then they need to organize and have a purpose in mind. And when all else fails, you can turn to litigation. And at Southeastern Legal, we do the important work of defending Americans from state-sanctioned racism. Our main goal is to ensure the self-evident American truth that all men are created equal. Southeastern Legal has been doing this for decades. We've taken cases to the Supreme Court and we have won them. And now we are at the forefront of challenging the infiltration of CRT into our schools, resulting in differential treatment based on race. We look forward to continuing to serve, and your listeners can find us at slfliberty.org, or they can also follow our Twitter page at @slf_liberty.
You know, Braden, we've been talking about critical race theory, but there's critical queer theory, there's critical feminist theory, and they divide in the same way, because with the critical feminist theory, for example, male students are often targeted and made to feel as lesser human beings because they happen to be male rather than female. And then with the critical queer theory, which is also reaching the kindergarten level, we find that children who are heterosexual are being made to feel as lesser human beings. And so all of this has Marxist roots. And I don't know, Braden, if in college you studied Marxism, and I know you're very focused, and we all are, on critical race theory, but it's only one of the critical theories, and it's all about taking down America, destroying our Judeo-Christian values and structures. That's my statement, but I would like to hear your reaction.
Well, it's certainly true that there's a variety of forms of critical theory, but what they all share in common is its Marxist roots and the idea that America is divided between oppressor and oppressed, and that we need to reject individual liberty in order to secure equal outcomes between oppressor and oppressed. Now, the linking concept here is intersectionality.
Yes.
That's how you get critical race theory joined with critical gender theory and joined with critical sexuality theory. But the idea there is to get as many groups under the umbrella of oppressor and to push back on our regular constitutional order. But, to your point about Marxism, Marx was kind of wrong. Marx thought that class was ultimately the way to shatter society. And Marxists for a long time have been flummoxed by the fact that in America, the working class doesn't perceive itself as in tension with the productive class, the entrepreneurial class. And so what happened in the 60s was just a repackaging of Marxist theory under the guise of race, which is America's sore spot, and then just utterly advancing the same ideas.
Right. There's so much going on for people to process, and I'm so glad that you're out there, helping to fight the battle. And I also know that for white people, they are at a moment where they feel like, many of them feel like they can't speak, they're afraid of being called racist, and that's used to silence them. But according to critical race theory, they might as well relax. Critical race theory says that they are all racist, they are all dangerous, and they all have to renounce, being born in white skin. So thank you so much for being my guest today on Conversations, and we wish you well with your work, and we're going to be following it and also maybe having you back on as your case progresses.
Thank you, Dr. Swain. It's my pleasure.
All right, we will be back after this moment from our sponsors.
For those of you who would like to know what exactly our children are facing in their education system, this is a must-read book. It will equip you and prepare you to make decisions about your child's health, about your child's education. So I want to encourage every one of you to grab a copy of Dr. Swain's book and join with me and Carol on the front lines in this critical time to eradicate the liberal abduction of our children.
Thank you so much for watching. For those of you who would like to follow Braden and his case, Braden, why don't you tell them how they can support you? I know you mentioned it earlier, but give the website again and ways that they can keep up with this litigation.
Thanks, Carol. It's at slfliberty.org. Our Twitter page is at @slf_liberty. And we really appreciate all of the support. We only exist through the generosity of our donors. And your support's greatly appreciated. Stay tuned. We're going to keep bringing a lot more cases on this front.
Thank you. And thank you for tuning in. I will see you next week with another interesting guest.